It's good to see you here on this most solemn of days. We begin these talks in 1983, and as Rabbi Kroloff said, that's 41 years that we've been doing this. One could make the case that this is the most difficult year for Israel because Israel is so threatened and so vulnerable. Of course, one could make the opposite case, that Israel is, despite the threats to her existence, exceptionally strong, having defeated so many of her enemies, the Iranians, the Houthis, the Hezbollah, Syria. And not only that, there's now a peace deal on the table, put there by President Trump in the United States. Some would argue a very good thing for Israel, and we'll come to that. What we'll try to do today is sort all of this out. Is Israel strong or weak, able or unable to face her enemies? And then we'll talk about our relationship to Israel and what we can do to help and strengthen Israel during this difficult time. Now, my central thesis is the war in Gaza started out as a just war, but it became something else. When Israel started this war 2 years ago, everybody understood that it would have to strike hard at Hamas's military capabilities. Hamas had killed 1,200 Israelis. It had taken 250 captives. It had beheaded babies. It had raped women. It had uploaded its slaughter to the internet for all the world to see. The only possible response to this was to rain down on Hamas the most painful blow in its history, searing into the mind of Palestinians and Islamists that anyone who commits a crime of this kind against the Jewish people will pay with blood, sweat, and tears. And Israel did just that. In fact, all that was achieved more than a year ago. And today, after another year of war, Gaza in its entirety lies devastated down to its foundation. More than 60,000 Gazans have been killed, about half of them civilians. The entire leadership, low-ranking, high-ranking, in the middle of Hamas have been killed, and we do not weep for the Hamas leadership. We weep for the civilians. We certainly weep for the children, but not for the Hamas leaders. But the point is, a year ago, the war was won and should have been stopped. A deal should have been struck and could have been struck. The hostages could have been returned. This is not an absolute certainty. There's no absolute certainty in war, but something that most experts, including Israeli military experts and generals, believe. But Netanyahu chose not to end the war and instead to achieve total victory. What is total victory? Total victory is this: every last Hamas fighter is to be killed, and those who are not killed will throw down their weapons and surrender. Netanyahu said again and again, if we leave even a small number of Hamas fighters in Gaza, they will regroup, rebuild their fighting capacity, and will attack us again. We did not face the calamity of October 7th, he said, so that we could face another calamity in the future. And there is a certain logic to this. It is best to have no illusions about Hamas. But here's the problem. Hamas fighters are what I call ideological terrorists. Ideological terrorists are religiously motivated, and they do not throw down their weapons and surrender, ever. They simply don't. Even when they are outnumbered, even when they face certain death, they continue to fight. And therefore, Bibi's plan for total victory was likely to lead to something else altogether: increasing losses for the IDF, the Israel Defense Forces, to Gaza civilians, and to Israel's global reputation. In a war like this, there is no global victory, no total victory. Let's take a look at how this played out. By mid-2024, Israel had largely neutralized Hamas as a conventional fighting force. The IDF had overrun Hamas strongholds in Gaza City and beyond, destroyed dozens of tunnels, killed thousands of Hamas fighters. It had located and eliminated Yahya Sinwar, the Hamas leader. Not only that, Israel had defeated Hezbollah in Lebanon, a very significant victory. At this point, the benefits of continuing a full-scale war against Hamas became questionable. What forces remained of Hamas in Gaza were driven underground and had shifted to guerrilla tactics. Small pockets of fighters still existed, but hunting them all down was impossible. And these terrorists had no ability to launch a large-scale attack like October 7th. As a conventional military threat, Hamas had been neutered. At this point, most of Israel's military opposed continuing the war. They urged Israel to shift toward a ceasefire or diplomatic talks. The idea was that Israel would take control of Gaza's borders, would stop the bombardments that were killing more and more Gaza civilians, would respond harshly and quickly to terrorist attacks that emerged from Gaza, would demand that all hostages be returned, and would agree, reluctantly, to some Hamas presence in Gaza. This was not a perfect solution, and it certainly was not total victory. But it was better than the alternative, which was the IDF fighting without a clear goal, trying to destroy every single Hamas tunnel, Israeli soldiers still at risk and suffering casualties every day, and Gaza civilians pushed further and further into utter despair. And this too, absent a clear day-after strategy, the hostages were in constant danger, and their chance of emerging alive diminished with every passing hour. The hostage issue has been deeply emotional for Israelis and for Jews everywhere. Netanyahu said that the hostages would be saved by applying maximum force in eradicating Hamas. This made no sense, as most Israelis recognized. The more force you apply, the greater the risk to the hostages. Israel has managed to rescue a tiny handful of hostages through military operations, but the rest remain hidden in Hamas's tunnel system. In one well-known case, there were 6 hostages that were held by Hamas. Israeli forces approached them, and they were all executed. They were all executed. Israeli forces cannot storm those tunnels without almost certain death for the captives. Israeli generals have acknowledged this and have said in the clearest possible way that without a ceasefire or a deal, those hostages are unlikely to return home. And just as the hostages cannot be saved by force alone, Hamas cannot be defeated by force alone. As I've already said, Hamas constitutes no threat to Israeli forces, but it cannot be fully eradicated if that means killing every single Hamas terrorist. There is always another naive 15-year-old that Hamas can recruit. Always. Far better for Israel's army to focus on the art of the possible, which means deterring future attacks and securing Israel's borders. And we should keep in mind the tremendous pressure that has been brought to bear on Israel's army. The campaign became a war of attrition with no clear end in sight. Israel's army has been mobilized for 2 years, including those who died on October 7th. Nearly 1,000 Israeli soldiers have died in the war in Gaza, with thousands more wounded. We talk a lot about it, Gazan casualties, as we must, but we need to remember Israeli casualties. The equivalent in America to Israeli dead would be 33,000 dead. Israel's army is a citizen's army. It does not have the capacity to fight a perpetual war. By turning the war in Gaza into an indefinite quagmire while spouting the illusion of total victory, Netanyahu undermined the military, which is trained for quick, decisive action, not forever war. Again, remember, most of these people are civilians like you and me. And the result is that the IDF is bleeding and exhausted. Remember, this is the longest war that Israel has ever fought by far. Another factor, of course, is the Palestinian dead. I'm not going to discuss this at length because, rightly, it's been much discussed. And, of course, we heard from Rabbi Prosnit last night, his wonderful sermon. But let me say this. The numbers we hear of Palestinian casualties, 60 to 65,000, are definitely exaggerated. The Hamas stooges in the Ministry of Health issue casualty numbers, and then the world media repeats them verbatim. And Israel has taken multiple steps to limit those casualties, for which they have been given far too little credit. And this too, after Japan attacked the United States, we responded by killing 1 million Japanese. After the Germans declared war on us, we responded by killing 3 million Germans. We need some perspective on those 60,000 deaths. Nonetheless, just as no moral person can defend the use of children as human shields, a despicable tactic of Hamas terrorists, so too no moral person can defend the killing and near starvation of so many defenseless children in Gaza, even if this was never Israel's intention. And it was never Israel's intention. Now let's turn to what is perhaps the most alarming consequence of Netanyahu's refusal to stop the war, and that is the collapse of Israel's standing abroad, even among its closest allies. What began as criticism over civilian casualties turned in some quarters into accusations of war crimes and genocide. As Bibi pressed his assault, Israel's image morphed into that of a cruel occupying power, risking pariah status and boycotts. Nowhere is this trend more apparent than in the United States. Only 32% of Americans approve of Israel's actions in Gaza. Among Democrats, the approval rating is 8%, single digits. A majority of Americans, 53%, now view Israel unfavorably. In Europe, the situation is even worse and still deteriorating. More Europeans now sympathize with the Palestinians than with Israel by margins of 2 to 1 or more. Approximately 160 countries in the world recognize the Palestinian state, including most of Israel's closest allies in Europe. The possibility of Israel being treated similarly to apartheid South Africa, no longer seems impossible or even unlikely. Is some of what is happening anti-Semitism? You bet. For example, it's ironic to read the vicious attacks of Ireland on Israel. Ireland, an anti-Semitic country with a long domestic history of terrorism that includes support of the IRA and long-standing sympathy with terrorist insurgency in all forms. And Spain and other countries that have no right to speak to Israel's shortcomings. But here's the thing. Even if these attacks are motivated by hostility to Jews in Israel, that does not make what Israel is doing either right or smart. And we can say this for sure. A lot of what Israel is doing is not very smart. Why did Netanyahu persist in this ruinous course? As we discussed last year at length, much of the answer lies in domestic Israeli politics. Bibi wanted to keep his coalition together. If it falls, there will be an election that he will probably lose. His criminal trial will resume. There will be an official inquiry into October 7th. Therefore, he is desperate to stay in office. But his coalition partners are ultra-nationalists and messianic ideologues. My president discussed this last night. He was too gentle, in my view. Kahanas. They're racists and Kahanas, and they occupy senior positions in the government of Israel, and who would have imagined? They've openly called for annexing Gaza. For them, any compromise in Gaza means betrayal. Secondly, the one man who could make a difference here and prod Israel in a new direction is Donald Trump. But Bibi has received encouragement from Trump for his hardline stance. Until now, Trump has openly supported Netanyahu's aggressive policies and dismissed calls for restraint. And all of this that you've just heard serves as background for what's happened in the past week and what we heard at the White House on Monday. Why are Netanyahu and Trump putting forward a peace plan after 2 years of war? My view, the answer is simple. They both recognize that their policies were not working. Bibi realized, finally, after great cost to Israel and to Gaza, that the war would not produce the results that he wanted, and he had to bring it to an end. He realized that Hamas terrorists were not going to emerge from the tunnels with their hands up, holding a white flag. It was not going to happen. And so, having no choice, and with great reluctance, he went along with the Trump plan, which contained elements that were the exact opposite of the total victory plan that he had been promoting. And when he presented the plan at the White House press conference, if those of you saw the press conference, President Trump got up and he presented the plan at great length, burbling on. But nonetheless, he presented the plan. And then after that, Bibi presented supposedly the same plan. But when Bibi presented it, he described it as the total victory that he hoped to get but didn't. There'd be no Palestinian state, he said. The Palestinian Authority would play no role in reconstruction of Gaza. Thinking that his government might fall and he might have to go to elections, he wanted to present the plan in as positive a light as possible. And so he said that the Palestinians would be denied any role. But in fact, the plan said exactly the opposite. And President Trump had just said exactly the opposite. It specifically called for a Palestinian state and called for a Palestinian Authority role in Gaza's governance. Netanyahu, who also had to apologize to the Prime Minister of Qatar, actually pronounced Qatar, but usually pronounced Qatar, Netanyahu was humiliated. His plan for total victory brought the opposite of total victory and officially put on the table a plan for a Palestinian state that Bibi had opposed for decades. And what of Trump? While Bibi was humiliated, Trump emerges as the hero of the story. Never thought I would say those words, but there they are. When Bibi was seen as a strong leader and popular with the MAGA troops, Trump backed him. When Bibi was seen as more and more ineffective and a loser, Trump switched sides. Our president, as you know, only jumps on winning bandwagons. And here he did something that no other American president has done. He came up with his own plan and delivered the Arab world and Turkey to back it. If there's optimism about the Trump plan, it is because broad Arab support gives it legitimacy that no plan has ever had before. For this, Trump deserves full credit. He recognized if there was to be any chance of a real peace, he would need the Saudis in his camp to support it and Saudi allies. And his team, mainly Witkoff and Kushner, made that happen, enlisting the whole Arab world in the process. Will a stable peace result from the current plan? In my view, probably not. Will Hamas repent? Will terrorism end? Will the Arab coalition be prepared to act against Hamas violence militarily? Will Gaza be rebuilt and become a Riviera, as Trump said? Will the committee that Trump is heading actually work? Will he have the patience and the desire to make it work? Divisions in the Arab world are so great and religious fanaticism is so deeply embedded that it's almost impossible to imagine a peaceful process of renovation and rebuilding taking place. And then there's Bibi, who's opposed to the kind of peace that Trump and the Arab world are committed to. He does not want a peace that includes the Palestinian Authority and will lead to a Palestinian state. He said that again and again since the press conference. Many people feel that while he has publicly accepted the Trump plan, he will now raise endless objections to various parts of the plan in the hope that his obstructionism will eventually lead the plan to collapse, and that his ally will be Hamas, which also, like Bibi, is opposed to the two-state solution that Trump hopes to deliver. Having said all that, there exists some chance that the momentum of the moment will deliver a ceasefire and a return of the hostages. That is far from a full peace, but it is something. It means the war will stop, at least for a while, and that the hostages will be returned home. Right now, there's pressure on all parties, on Hamas, on Bibi, on the Arab coalition, on the Trump foreign policy team. And perhaps that will be enough to stop the fighting, at least for a while. And if so, a number of good things will happen. Bibi will have to end the war, his government will be dissolved, elections will be called in Israel, and Israelis will be given the chance finally to render a judgment on a government that was responsible for October 7th, the most radical government in Israel's history, and a government, as I said, that trashed Israel's global reputation in an unprecedented way. Until now, Bibi has done everything possible to avoid elections, but hopefully the democratic process will now be given a chance to work and the Israeli people will have their say. Also, despite the fact that Bibi swears there will never be a Palestinian state, the Trump plan includes the term Palestinian state and restores negotiations over the establishment of a Palestinian state to the global agenda. It will simply no longer be possible for Israel to claim that a Palestinian state is off the table. It will be part of a near universal consensus backed by the United States and at the heart of any political negotiations. And it will be a direct repudiation of the politics of Ben-Gvir and Smotrich. None of this is certain, but it's possible. It's the best we're likely to get and something we can hope for. Now let me finish up by saying just a few words about what we can do for Israel. Let's be honest, big picture, we can't do a lot. Bibi is not listening to American Jews, certainly not listening to us, but there are small things that we can do to make a difference. And if they won't make a difference short term, they will long term. I'm going to mention 4 things very quickly. First, when Rabbi Rick Jacobs was asked last week the question of what we might do, he said, support the reform movement in Israel. I agree with that. Until fairly recently, Reform Judaism in Israel was a marginal movement with minimum influence. But that is changing. And the fact is that Israelis need Reform Judaism. They need our experience with pluralism, our knowledge of bridge building, our religious energy, our commitment to tolerance and Jewish religious diversity. So when you next give to Israel, put the reform movement in Israel at the top of your list. Not in the middle and not at the bottom, but maybe at the top. good for Reform Judaism, good for Israel. Second, stop supporting the 64 members of Knesset who make up the current government of Israel. I have never in my life called on people, Jews or non-Jews, not to support a legitimately elected Israeli government. But this current government is the most radical in Israel's history, led by Kahanis, racists, criminals, and draft-dodging ultra-Orthodox Jews. 1,000 Israeli dead, military dead, and no Haredim, no ultra-Orthodox participating in the fight. Busha, scandal, it's an embarrassment. This is a rogue government opposed by nearly every sector of Israeli society. Support instead the other 56 members of Knesset, most of whom are devoted Zionists, committed to democratic values and some form of a reasonable peace agreement with the Palestinians. Third, support the demonstrators who take to the streets every single week, fighting for the rule of law, and support the institutions of Israeli civil society that fight for civil rights for all citizens of Israel. Don't think that there are no heroes left in Israel. Israelis have been demonstrating in enormous numbers for over 2 years, week after week, closing down traffic, demanding justice, and an end to this disgraceful government. Israelis, like Americans, face an increasingly authoritarian government. But unlike Americans, Israelis in massive numbers raised their voices and put their bodies on the line. Inspiring. Finally, maybe most important, learn how to advocate for Israel and how to make Israel's case to your own children and to those people who make up the great American middle. Americans on the far right and far left are mostly a lost cause when it comes to Israel. But the centrists, who are always the heart of the pro-Israel sentiment, are the ones who are drifting away. In the Democratic Party, as we said, support is in single digits. And again, our own children, not to mention our neighbors and friends, are too often in that category. Do you know how to sit down, look them in the eye, and convince them that Israel, despite this terrible government, remains critically important and worthy of our support? Do you know how to tell them that a single state from the river to the sea will not be a binational state, but an Arab state, in which the Jews will be an oppressed and persecuted minority? Do you know how to tell them that there is not a single European state today, not one, in which the Jews are secure? That anti-Semitism is rampant everywhere. And that is why the founders of Israel knew that we needed a Jewish and democratic state that would offer a physical refuge for the Jews of the world. Do you know how to tell them that Israel is an imperfect state, currently broken, and led by extremists and zealots, but that with Jewish energy and creativity it can be fixed? And that it must be fixed because without Israel, we are a truncated, incomplete people. And are you ready to tell them that our love for Israel, now and always, is eternal? And we must proclaim it in unconditional and unmistakable tones. If you don't know how to do these things, learn. Nothing is more important. And to you all, Gemar Chatima Tova, may you be inscribed for blessing in the book of life.